He didn't knock. That was the first thing Clara noticed, the way Ethan Blackwood swung down from his horse and walked straight toward her door like the land already belonged to him, like she was the one trespassing on her own porch. He had a folded paper in his hand and the kind of expression men wore when they'd already decided how a conversation was going to end. He held up the document and said, flat as a hammer striking stone, "You've got 30 days to vacate, Mrs. Whitmore. After that, I'll have the sheriff remove you." Behind Clara, 5 children stood in a row. The oldest was 12. The youngest had just turned 4. None of them made a sound. If that were you standing there, with nothing left but the ground under your feet and the children behind you, what would you do? Before we go any further, if a story like this speaks to you, if it makes you feel something real, please take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled, because every single comment you leave tells me this work matters, and that means I keep making it. Now let's get back to Clara. The morning Ethan Blackwood rode onto the Willow Creek property, the temperature had already dropped 10 degrees from the night before, and the sky was the color of old pewter. Clara had been awake since 4, as she was most mornings. She'd fed the chickens, checked the fence line along the east pasture where the third post had been leaning since August, and started a pot of oatmeal on the iron stove that took 3 pieces of kindling and a whispered word of frustration before it agreed to light. She was pouring water into the pot when she heard the hoofbeats. Not 1 horse. 2. She set the pitcher down slowly. In 2 years of managing the farm alone, she'd learned to read the sound of things, the difference between a neighbor's casual visit and something with purpose behind it. These hoofbeats had purpose. They were measured, unhurried, the way a man moved when he didn't need to rush because he already knew he was going to win. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside. Ethan Blackwood was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. She'd heard his name in town, of course. Everyone in the county had. He was the man who owned the grain mill on the North Road, 2 cattle ranches further east, and a controlling stake in the Harding lumber operation that had been clear-cutting timber since spring. People talked about him the way they talked about weather, not with hatred exactly, but with a kind of tired resignation. He existed. He was powerful. There wasn't much to be done about either fact. He was younger than she'd imagined, tall, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 3 or 4 days, and dark eyes that moved across her property with the quick, assessing look of a man counting inventory. I was riding a black horse, of course he was, and he had a second man with him, a younger fellow who stayed in the saddle and kept his eyes down like he'd seen this particular errand done before and wasn't proud of his part in it. Ethan stopped about 10 feet from her porch steps. He looked at her. Then he looked at the fence, then the barn, then back at her. Clara crossed her arms. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. She hadn't planned to say his name first, but she wasn't going to let him think she didn't know exactly who he was. Something shifted in his expression, just barely, a slight tightening around the eyes. He hadn't expected her to know him. "Mrs. Whitmore." He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded paper. He held it out toward her. "I think you know why I'm here." She didn't move from where she stood. "You can keep holding it. I already know what it says." He didn't lower his arm. "Then you know the situation." "I know your version of the situation." The words came out steadier than she felt. Her heart was moving faster than she wanted it to, but she'd spent 2 years keeping her voice level in front of the children, and that discipline had become its own kind of armor. Ethan stepped forward and set the paper on the porch railing. "Your husband borrowed $420 from my bank in the spring of 1887. He used this property as collateral. He passed in February of last year. The debt was never settled." He paused. "I've waited longer than most men would have." "You've waited because you hoped I'd give up on my own," Clara said. "Save you the trouble of having to look me in the eye when you did it." He didn't flinch. She gave him that much. He didn't look away. "I'm not here to argue the ethics of lending, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm here because a legal obligation exists and it hasn't been met." "A legal obligation?" She let the words sit in the air a moment. "My husband is dead, Mr. Blackwood. My children's father. I've been working this land alone since February with no hired help, no family nearby, and a harvest coming in 3 weeks. That's the first real yield this property's had in 4 years. That's the context your legal obligation exists inside of." I understand your circumstances are difficult. No. Her voice didn't rise, but it changed, went quieter in a way that carried further. You don't. You couldn't. A man who spent his life adding to what he owns doesn't understand what it's like to fight every single day just to keep from losing what little you have left. The second man on horseback shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her, at the door she'd left open behind her, and Clara knew he was counting children. She heard them inside. The shuffle of bare feet on floorboards, the younger ones awake now, drawn by the voices. 30 days, he said. He tapped the paper on the railing once. That's more than the law requires. He turned and walked back to his horse. Clara stood exactly where she was, arms still crossed, until both horses had gone back through the gate and disappeared around the bend in the road. Then she turned, walked inside, and closed the door quietly behind her. She stood with her back against it for a moment, one hand pressed flat to the wood. Mama? That was Thomas, her oldest. 12 years old and already carrying the particular careful expression of a boy who understood more than he should have to. I'm fine, she said. Go eat your breakfast. She pushed off from the door, went to the stove and stirred the oatmeal. Her hand was shaking slightly. She ignored it. Puss. Clara Whitmore had not come to Montana expecting things to be easy. She had come because her husband, Robert, had talked about the land with the particular kind of light in his eyes that a man gets when he believes absolutely in something. And she had loved that light enough to follow it 1,500 miles from Ohio. Robert was not a bad man. He was a hopeful one, and in the West in those years, hope and poor judgment sometimes wore the same face. He'd borrowed the money during a season when the wheat looked strong and the future looked stronger. And then the season had turned and the wheat had failed and Robert had kept the worry entirely to himself, the way he kept most things, right up until the morning. She found him slumped against the barn wall and understood that he had taken his secrets with him. She'd spent the first month after his death in a kind of mechanical fog, cooking, feeding, mending, sleeping just enough to keep functioning. The grief came in pieces, at odd moments. She'd reach for the coffee tin and remember that she'd always made his cup first. She'd hear one of the younger children call for their father in their sleep, and she'd lie still in the dark and breathe through it until they settled. She didn't cry in front of the children. She'd made that decision early and kept it. What she had instead of tears was work. There was always work. The fence post that leaned, the hen that wasn't laying, the water pump that stuck on cold mornings and required a specific combination of pressure and patience to coax into moving. She learned all of it. She got better at most of it. A few things she never fully mastered but managed anyway through stubbornness and repetition. 5 children was a number that still sometimes startled her when she thought about it from the outside. Thomas at 12, Margaret at 10, twins Will and James at 8, and little Ruth, who was 4, and had Robert's exact expression when she was concentrating on something. 5 children, 42 acres, 1 aging draft horse, and a mortgage she hadn't known existed until the bank sent a letter 3 months after the funeral. She'd written back asking for time. They'd given her some. Then more. Then Ethan Blackwood had apparently purchased the debt. She'd received a new letter with a new name at the top. And now here they were. 30 days. She ate breakfast standing up at the counter while the children ate at the table. Thomas watched her with that careful look. Margaret chattered about the cat that had been hanging around the barn. The twins argued about something minor and pointless, and she let them because the sound of it was almost comforting in its normalcy. She needed a plan, Chem. The plan, when it came to her, was either very smart or very stupid, and she couldn't tell which. She needed to talk to Ethan Blackwood again, not to beg. She'd spent some time the night before getting completely clear with herself about that, but to negotiate. There was wheat in that field, real wheat, more than she'd ever seen on this property. 6, maybe 7 acres of it, and it was close. Another 3 weeks and she could harvest. She'd calculated the numbers 3 different ways, and each time came out to roughly $250 if the prices held. Not enough to clear the debt entirely, but enough to make a serious offer. Enough to show him she wasn't asking for charity. She was asking for the chance to do what was right. She left Thomas in charge and drove the wagon into town. The Blackwood land office was on the main street between the hardware store and the saddle shop. She'd walked past it 100 times without ever going inside. The man at the front desk was the same young fellow who'd ridden out with Ethan the day before. He looked up when she walked in and had the decency to look slightly ashamed. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood," she said. "He's not—" "I'll wait." She sat in the wooden chair by the window and she waited. People walked past outside. Two women she recognized from church glanced in and she met their eyes without expression until they looked away. An hour passed. Maybe more. Ethan came through the back door with mud on his boots and sawdust on his coat, carrying a sheaf of papers, already talking to someone behind him. He stopped when he saw her. The young man at the desk said nothing. Smart. Clara stood. "I'd like 5 minutes of your time, in private." Ethan looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then he held the door to his office open and waited. She walked in and he closed the door behind them. 3 weeks, she said. She didn't sit. "That's all I'm asking. The wheat is ready in 3 weeks. I harvest it, I bring you $250, and we establish a payment schedule for the remainder. I'm not asking you to forgive the debt. I'm asking you to give me the chance to start paying it." He sat down. She hadn't expected that. It somehow made him easier to look at. "Mrs. Whitmore, I know what you're going to say. You've been patient. The law is on your side. My circumstances aren't your responsibility." She spread her hands slightly. "You're right, on all of it. But I'm also right that there is a real crop in that field that belongs to the land you're about to take. And if you take the land now, you get the crop anyway. But you take it from 5 children who've already lost their father. And you are the kind of man who has to live with that." Something crossed his face. Quick, gone. 7 days, he said. She blinked. "I said 3 weeks. I'll send 2 of my men to help with the harvest. 7 days. You bring me what you make, and I'll count it against the debt, and we'll discuss terms for the rest." Clara stared at him. "Why?" He picked up his pen, looked at the papers on his desk. "Because you're right that I'll get the crop either way. This is more efficient." She didn't believe that was the reason. She wasn't going to argue about it. 7 days, she said. She turned and walked out. That afternoon, standing in the field with the sun low and warm on her shoulders, running her hand through the tops of the wheat stalks to feel their weight, she let herself acknowledge for the first time what she'd been refusing to acknowledge all day. She was afraid. Not of Ethan Blackwood specifically. Not of losing the farm, though she was afraid of that too. She was afraid of the thing underneath, the possibility that she'd built all of this courage and stubbornness on top of pure exhaustion, and that sooner or later the exhaustion was going to win. That one morning she was going to wake up and not be able to find the thing inside her that kept going. Thomas came up beside her. He didn't say anything, just stood there, looking at the wheat. After a while he said, "Is it going to be okay, Mama?" She kept her eyes on the field. "Yes," she said. She wasn't sure if she believed it, but she said it like she did, and sometimes that was how you found your way there, by saying it out loud until it became the kind of truth you could hold on to. Behind them, the last light was going out of the sky over the western hills. Somewhere in the barn, the old draft horse shifted his weight and sighed, and the sound of it carried across the yard like the land itself settling in for the night. 3 weeks of wheat, 7 days of help from a man who had come to take everything she owned. Clara Whitmore squared her shoulders and went inside to start dinner. Ethan Blackwood's 2 men arrived at dawn the next morning, which was exactly what he'd said would happen, and still somehow surprised her. She'd been up since before light, the way she always was, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, going cold in her hand, watching the darkness in the east begin to separate itself from the tree line. She'd barely slept. Not because of fear exactly. She'd moved past fear sometime around midnight and into a kind of grim, practical clarity, but because her mind kept running the numbers. 7 days. 6 acres, maybe 7. 2 men to help. She'd calculated how many rows they could clear per hour if the weather held, how many bushels she could expect per acre given the dry spell in July, what price Hendricks at the grain exchange was likely to offer if she came in with the whole harvest at once rather than in pieces. She was still running numbers when she heard the wagon. 2 men. One was heavy-set with a red beard and a quiet manner. He introduced himself as Pete and shook her hand without being asked to, which she counted as a good sign. The other was younger, maybe 19, with the kind of nervous energy that showed in his hands. He said his name was Cody and immediately tripped over the bottom porch step. "Careful," Thomas said from the doorway. in the flat, serious tone he'd been using lately that sounded disconcertingly like his father. Cody righted himself and looked at the boy. "Thanks." "The step's been loose since March," Thomas said. "Mama's been meaning to fix it." "I've been meaning to fix a lot of things," Clara said. "Come around the back. I'll show you where we're starting." She took them to the east field first, because the wheat there was fullest, heaviest at the top, and she wanted them to see what they were working with before she said anything about pace or method. She watched Pete walk a few rows in, bend down, run a handful of stalks through his fingers the way an experienced man did when he was estimating. He looked up at her with a slightly surprised expression. "This is good wheat," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." He nodded once, like that settled something. They got to work. The first day was hard in the particular way that physical labor is hard, not in the sharp, sudden way of crisis, but in the slow, grinding way that builds through hours and settles into the body like weight. Clara worked alongside them. She'd told herself she would manage and direct, but within an hour she'd picked up a scythe and was cutting rows because standing back and watching felt worse than the ache in her shoulders. Margaret took over the house and the younger children without being asked, which was its own small grief. A 10-year-old who already knew when her mother needed both hands free. The twins kept trying to help in the field until Clara sent them back twice. The third time she caught them, she put them to work bundling the cut stalks, which was real work, and kept them occupied and stopped the argument. Ruth followed Cody around the field for most of the morning because he had a way with small children, which surprised her, and by afternoon he'd taught her a game involving counting stalks that kept her content near the edge of the field without being underfoot. It should have felt strange, having hired men on the property. Men sent by Ethan Blackwood specifically. It didn't, quite. Pete worked like a man who'd grown up doing it, efficient and unhurried, and he didn't talk much, which Clara appreciated. Cody worked with enthusiasm that outpaced his skill, and Thomas appointed himself an unofficial corrector, following 2 steps behind and adjusting the younger man's bundling technique with patient, bossy precision. By evening, they'd cleared nearly 2 full acres. Clara stood at the edge of the field in the cooling air and looked at what they'd done and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not relief. It was too early for relief, but something adjacent to it. The suggestion that this might actually be possible. She fed them dinner. It felt wrong not to. She made a large pot of beef stew with the last of the root vegetables from the cellar and biscuits that came out uneven on one side, because the oven ran hotter on the left than the right, and she kept forgetting to rotate the pan. Pete ate 2 bowls and didn't mention the biscuits. Cody ate 3 and said they were the best he'd had, which was probably not true, but she gave him credit for saying it. After they left, she sat at the table with the account book open in front of her and wrote down the day's numbers. 2 acres. If the pace held and the weather held and nothing went wrong, a series of conditions that required a particular kind of optimism she was still negotiating with herself about, she could make it. Thomas sat across from her, pretending to read a book. "Go to bed," she said without looking up. "I'm not tired." "You were up at 4. So were you." She looked up then. He was watching her with that careful expression, and under it was something younger. The actual 12-year-old beneath the collected exterior he'd been wearing all year like borrowed clothing. "It's going to work," she said. Not the way she'd said it in the field the night before, like a thing she was trying to convince herself of, more like a fact she was laying down between them. "We're going to get through this week, and we're going to make the payment, and then we're going to figure out the rest." He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Not I believe you, just okay." The conditional faith of a child who's been disappointed by enough adult certainties to stop taking them for granted. It hurt a little, the way accurate things sometimes do. "Okay," she said back. "Go to bed." He went. Well, on the second day, Ethan Blackwood came himself. She didn't know he was coming. There was no warning. He simply appeared at the gate on his black horse around mid-morning, and she saw him from the field and felt her shoulders tighten automatically, the way they had when he'd walked up to her porch 2 days ago. He rode in slowly and dismounted and tied the horse to the post, and then stood there looking at the field. Not at her. At the field. Taking in how much had been cleared, the quality of the bundled stalks, the way the remaining wheat stood. Pete saw him and lifted a hand in greeting, which told Clara this was not unusual behavior. Their employer came to check on things. That was normal. She kept cutting and didn't go to him. He came to her instead. He stood at the edge of her row for a moment. She finished the section she was on before she looked up. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore." He looked at the field again. "You're ahead of where I expected." "Good." She moved to start the next row. "I wanted to check that Pete and Cody they were being useful." "They are." She paused, because that much honesty required a little more. Pete especially. He works hard and he doesn't need direction. Cody is learning. She glanced sideways at him. "He's good with my youngest." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Not much. Just a slight softening around the eyes that he seemed to immediately notice and pull back. He looked at Ruth, who had apparently abandoned Cody temporarily and was now sitting at the edge of the field with a collection of objects, a smooth stone, a bent piece of wire, something that might have been a doll made of bundled wheat, arranged in a row in front of her with serious attention. "She's 4?" he said. Last month." He was quiet for a moment. Clara kept working. "Is there anything the property needs beyond the harvest?" he said. "Supplies, tools." She stopped cutting, turned to look at him fully, which she hadn't done yet. "Why?" "Because if the land passes to me and it's in poor condition, that's a problem for me." He said it flatly, without heat. Pure pragmatism. Clara studied him. He had the kind of face that had made a decision a long time ago to give very little away. Not cold exactly, but controlled, the way a window was controlled. You could see through it if the light was right, but it didn't offer anything on its own. "The east fence needs 2 new posts," she said finally. "The water pump sticks in the morning. The barn roof has a soft spot above the second stall that I've been patching with boards and hoping it holds." She paused. "And the porch step is loose." He nodded, like she'd given him a list of business items. "I'll have someone look at the fence post today. You don't have to." "I have the men and the materials. It makes sense." He picked up his horse's reins. "I'll come back tomorrow to see the progress." He was already turning away when she said it. Not because she'd planned to, but because something about the afternoon light and the shape of the day made it feel less dangerous than it had before. "Mr. Blackwood, the men you sent, did you pick them specifically?" He looked back at her. "What do you mean?" "Pete. He's not young, and he's got the kind of hands that come from 30 years of field work. Cody's green, but he's patient with children." She watched his face. Someone thought about who to send. A pause. "Long enough to be meaningful." "Pete asked to come," Ethan said. "He grew up on a homestead, said it was a straightforward job." He left without answering the part about Cody. That evening, fixing supper, Clara found herself thinking about what Pete had let slip while they were taking their midday break. She hadn't asked. He'd mentioned it the way people sometimes mention things when their guard was down and the work was good and the sun was warm. He'd said that Ethan Blackwood had started with nothing, which surprised most people who knew him now. That he'd come west at 17 with a borrowed horse and less than $10 and had spent the next decade building what he had through work that Clara would recognize. The daily grinding kind, the kind that left marks. "What happened to him?" she'd said before she could stop herself. "He's not the kind of man who got that way from nothing but hard work." Pete had looked at her sideways. "That's his story to tell, ma'am." She hadn't pushed, but it sat with her in a way she hadn't expected. The third day brought clouds, which frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Not a storm, just a flat gray ceiling that moved in overnight and sat low and thick over the valley and made the air feel close. She was in the field by 5:30 before Pete and Cody arrived, checking the stalks, running her fingers along them, trying to assess how much moisture they'd taken on. Pete arrived and assessed the sky the way she had and said, "It'll hold today, maybe tomorrow. After that, I'm not sure." "We need 4 more days," Clara said. "Then we'll need to move faster." He looked at the field. "I can bring my brother. He's not hired by Blackwood, but he owes me a favor, and he's good with a scythe." She looked at him. "You'd do that?" He shrugged, the gesture of a man who treated small generosities as logistics. "If you want the harvest in, you want the harvest in. Tell him I'll feed him lunch and dinner." "That'll do it." Pete's brother, whose name was Frank, and who was even larger than Pete and said approximately 4 words the entire day, arrived by 8 that morning. They cleared 3 more acres by nightfall, Clara's hands were raw. She'd worn through the leather of her right glove somewhere around noon and kept working anyway, and by evening there were blisters on 3 fingers and a long scrape across her palm from a stubborn section of stalks. She rinsed her hand at the pump and wrapped it in a strip of cloth from the rag bin and didn't mention it to anyone. Thomas noticed anyway. He always noticed. But he'd learned from her the particular mercy of not mentioning things that couldn't be changed. Ethan came back on the 4th day as he'd said he would, and this time he didn't just observe. She was struggling with a section of wheat on the western edge of the field, where the soil was slightly lower and the stalks had grown thicker and the cutting was harder. Pete and Frank were working the far end. Cody was closer but dealing with a bundle that had come apart twice and was looking frustrated. She was bent into it, putting her weight behind the scythe, when Ethan appeared beside her and without a word took the tool from her hands. Not rudely, more the way you'd take a bag from someone who was carrying too much, a gesture so matter-of-fact it bypassed the usual arguments. She straightened, looked at him. He was already working, moving through the thick section with a practiced stroke that told her he knew exactly what he was doing. "You know how to do that," she said. "I know how to do a lot of things," he said, not looking up. She watched him for a moment. Then she went to the bundling, because there was always something to do and the work didn't wait. They worked in silence for a while, which was oddly comfortable. Not companionable exactly. It was too early for that, too much still unresolved between them. But not hostile either. The silence of people who had agreed, at least for now, to focus on the task. "You own a cattle ranch," she said after a while. "2," he said. "So you didn't send for Pete and Cody because you happened to have idle men. You pulled them off something else." He didn't answer immediately. He finished the row he was on. "My spring branding's done. The summer work can manage for a week." "That wasn't what I asked." He looked at her then. Direct, with those dark eyes that gave very little and took in quite a lot. "No," he said. "It wasn't." She went back to bundling. She wasn't sure what she'd expected him to say. Maybe she hadn't expected anything. Maybe she just needed to establish that they both knew what the conversation wasn't saying. Around midday, when they broke for water, she heard something she hadn't heard in a long time on this property. She heard Ethan laugh. It came from the direction of the far fence line, where Ruth had apparently followed him and was showing him something. The same collection of objects she'd arranged the day before. The stone and the wire and the wheat stalk figure. Clara couldn't hear what Ruth was saying, but she could hear the pitch and rhythm of it. The 4-year-old's absolute certainty that whatever she was explaining was profoundly important, and that this man should feel privileged to receive the information. Ethan crouched down to Ruth's level and laughed, a short, real sound, startled out of him by whatever Ruth had said. Not the polished social laugh of a man performing good humor, but the involuntary kind that bypassed control. Ruth looked very pleased with herself. Clara turned back to her water and said nothing. That night, after the children were in bed, she sat on the porch with a second cup of coffee she probably didn't need and thought about what she knew and didn't know about Ethan Blackwood. She knew the outline, came from nothing, built an empire. Hard, controlled. Fair in his business dealings, by most accounts, but without warmth. People respected him the way they respected the river. You worked with it rather than against it, but you didn't mistake it for a friend. She knew what Pete had told her, which wasn't much. That Ethan had started with a borrowed horse and $10 and some kind of loss behind him that he didn't talk about. She knew what she'd seen herself. The way he'd pulled good men from his own operations to send to her farm. The way he'd come himself and worked beside her without making a production of it. The way he'd crouched in the dirt and listened to her 4-year-old daughter explain the deeply serious logic of her stone and wire collection. None of it matched the man who'd walked onto her porch with a legal document and a mouth set like a closed door. Or maybe it did. Maybe she'd been too focused on the door to notice what was behind it. She went inside. She had numbers to run. On the 5th day, Victor Harlan came to town, and things got complicated. Clara heard about it from Margaret, who had been sent to town for flour, and came back with the flour, and a troubled expression, and the information that Mr. Harlan had been having lunch at the hotel dining room, and had told anyone who would listen that Ethan Blackwood was making a fool of himself over the Whitmore widow, and that whatever was happening at the Willow Creek property was not a business arrangement. "He said it like it was something bad," Margaret said, setting the flour on the counter with more force than it needed. "Who told you this?" Clara asked. "Mrs. Garner." She wasn't happy about it either. Margaret looked at her mother. What does he want? Clara was quiet for a moment. The land, she said. Same thing everyone wants. Victor Harlan was not a man she knew well. She'd seen him twice, once at the land office, once at a county meeting about water rights. He was older, prosperous, with the particular confidence of a man who had always had money and therefore believed the world operated by rules that naturally favored him. He wanted the land along Willow Creek because it sat between two of his existing properties, and he'd been trying to acquire it for 3 years. Robert had refused to sell, which had made Harlan persistent in the patient, slow way of a man who believed that time and resources would eventually move all obstacles. Clara was an obstacle. What worried her was that Harlan talking publicly about Ethan Blackwood was not an accident. Men like Victor Harlan didn't say things by accident. They chose their words the way they chose their cards. If he was creating a story about Ethan losing his judgment over a widow, he was doing it because he thought it would either push Ethan to prove him wrong by moving faster, foreclosing immediately, taking the land before rumors made him look weak, or because it would drive a wedge between them at a moment when Clara needed whatever fragile understanding she and Ethan had managed to build. She finished the day's work with this sitting at the back of her mind like a stone she kept stepping around. When Ethan arrived that afternoon, and he did, as he had each day, with a reliability she'd started to unconsciously depend on, she could see something different in him. The set of his shoulders, the way he looked at Pete rather than at her when he spoke. She waited until Pete and Frank had taken the wagon out with the day's cut before she said anything. You heard about Harlan, she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan stopped where he was. A muscle tightened along his jaw. Yes. And? And it's nothing I haven't dealt with before. He said it with the flat certainty of a man repeating something he believed in his head, but was having to work slightly harder to believe in his chest. He's trying to push you into moving faster, Clara said. Take the land now before anyone thinks you've lost your business sense over a woman. I know what he's doing. So what are you going to do? He looked at her then, fully. The way he'd looked at her that first day on her porch, taking inventory. But different now, because what he was looking at had changed in both their understandings. What I said I was going to do, he said, give you 7 days, let you make the payment, discuss terms for the rest. Even if it costs you with Harlan, with the town? Clara, the name, her first name, out of his mouth for the first time. He said it like it had been there a while and had simply been waiting for the right moment to surface. What I owe Victor Harlan is nothing. What I told you is what I intend to do. She held his gaze. The evening light was coming low through the field, and the cut wheat smelled dry and clean, and somewhere behind her Ruth was singing a tuneless song to her collection of objects, and she was aware all at once of how strange and particular this moment was. The two of them standing in her field, the debt still between them, the town talking, the future still entirely unresolved, and something else present too that neither of them had named. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They went back to work. The 6th day brought the first real problem. Pete's brother Frank didn't come. A message arrived with Cody that Frank's wife had taken ill and he was needed at home. Clara nodded and said she understood and meant it, but the math changed in her head immediately. They were 1 man short with 1 full day plus what they could manage before dawn on day 7, and there were still roughly 1.5 acres standing. She worked harder. Her hands were bad. The blisters from 3 days ago had opened and closed, and the new skin underneath was tender in a way she kept noticing and ignoring. Pete watched her without comment, which she appreciated. Ethan arrived at noon and took in the situation immediately. He looked at the remaining field, then at Pete, then at Clara. He pulled off his coat, folded it over the fence rail, and picked up the spare scythe without asking anyone's permission. We can finish today, he said, if we don't stop. We'll need to stop to eat, Clara said, later. They didn't stop to eat. The children fed themselves. Margaret took charge with the quiet competence she'd been building all year. And Clara and Ethan and Pete and Cody worked through the afternoon without a real break. It was the hardest physical labor Clara had done since the spring planting, possibly harder. And by the time the light began to fail, her whole body felt like it had been wrung through wet and left to dry in the wind. But the field was clear. She stood at the center of it in the last light, breathing hard, looking at the cut stubble running in every direction, the bundled stalks laid in rows ready for threshing. Pete was a few rows over, hands on his knees, catching his breath. Cody was sitting flat on the ground with his legs straight out in front of him. Ethan was standing about 10 feet away, and he was looking at the field the same way she was, with the particular exhausted satisfaction of a person who has finished something difficult and hasn't yet shifted to what comes next. She walked over to where he stood, stopped beside him. "We're going to make it," she said. "Yes," he said. "Not I told you so. Not of course. Just yes, simple and quiet, like something he decided he was glad about." She was close enough to see the scratch along his forearm from the fence post they'd repaired that morning. He'd caught it on a nail and hadn't mentioned it, had just wiped the blood off with his handkerchief and kept working. She was close enough to see the lines in his face that she hadn't noticed on the first day. The ones that came not from age but from years of a particular kind of tension. The kind of face that had been waiting a very long time for something it had stopped expecting. She didn't say any of that. She said, "I'll feed everyone dinner," and turned and walked toward the house, because that was what the moment needed, and because she wasn't ready yet for whatever came after it. Behind her, she heard Thomas say, in his 12-year-old voice with its new gravity that she was still getting used to, "Mr. Blackwood, the porch step. I fixed it this afternoon." There was a pause. "Good work," Ethan said. And she could hear in it, even from 20 feet away, and with her back turned, that he meant it. She kept walking. Inside, Ruth met her at the door with both arms up. Clara picked her up without breaking stride, shifted the 4-year-old onto her hip, and stood at the kitchen window for one moment, looking out at the cleared field, and the evening coming down, and the man still standing in the stubble of her wheat. Then she put the water on to boil and started making dinner. The threshing took 2 days. Pete stayed to help with that too, which he hadn't been asked to do and which Clara suspected was his own decision rather than Ethan's instruction. He showed up the morning after the harvest with his threshing flail and his quiet manner and simply began. And she didn't ask questions about it because she'd learned that Pete communicated better through showing up than through explanation. Cody stayed as well, though his technique with the flail required supervision, and Thomas appointed himself to that task with the focused authority of someone who had watched Pete demonstrate it twice and therefore considered himself qualified to teach it. Cody, to his credit, didn't argue with the 12-year-old. He just adjusted his grip and tried again. Ethan didn't come those 2 days. Clara noticed his absence the way you noticed a sound stopping, not with alarm, but with a faint readjustment of the air. She'd grown used to the particular rhythm of his arrivals. The black horse at the gate, the unhurried way he dismounted, the way he'd started coming around to the field directly rather than stopping at the porch first, like a man who had learned the layout of a place and moved through it accordingly. She told herself his absence was appropriate. The harvest was done. The terms of their arrangement had been fulfilled. There was no business reason for him to be here anymore. She also told herself that the two things were not related, the absence and the ache she felt when she looked at the cleared field. On the morning of the 8th day, with the threshed grain bagged and loaded in the wagon, Clara drove to town. She went to the grain exchange first. Hendricks looked at the quality of the wheat, made a face that was half grimace and half admiration, and offered her $260. She countered at $280. They settled at $270, which was better than she'd calculated and worse than she'd hoped for, which was how most negotiations ended. She folded the money carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, the one she'd sewn an extra button onto specifically for days when she was carrying something she couldn't afford to lose. Then she walked to Blackwood's land office. The same young man was at the desk. He looked up and started to say something, and she said, "I know, I'll wait," and sat down. She waited 20 minutes this time instead of an hour, which felt like its own kind of acknowledgement. When Ethan came through the back door, he stopped the moment he saw her, and she saw something flicker across his face that was there and gone too fast for her to read it completely. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. She stood, reached into her coat, and set the folded bills on the desk between them. $270, she said, "against the debt. As agreed." He didn't move toward the money. He looked at it, then at her. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Clara." The name again, the same way as before, not a formality, not a title, just her name, used like he'd earned the right to it and wasn't sure yet what to do with that right. "Sit down, please." She sat. He sat across from her and pulled out a ledger and opened it to a page she couldn't read from where she was. He was quiet for a moment, looking at it. The original debt, with 2 years of interest at the rate specified in the contract, is $540. I know what it is. After your payment, the remaining balance is $270. He paused. I want to offer you new terms. She looked at him. What terms? $50 a year for the next 5 years, with no additional interest on the remainder. He set down his pen. That's less than $5 a month. The property remains in your name. The debt is cleared in 5 years. Clara was quiet for long enough that Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. Why? She said. Because the crop was good, and the arrangement worked, and that's not why. He looked at her. No, he said. It's not. The office was quiet. From outside came the sound of the street. A wagon passing, someone calling to someone else. The ordinary noise of a working town going about its business without any awareness of the particular weight of this small room. You came here to take my land, Clara said. Yes. And now you're offering me terms that mean you almost certainly never collect the full amount of money owed to you because I might have a bad year, or 2 bad years, or I have 5 children, Mr. Blackwood. There are 100 ways this arrangement could fail to benefit you financially. I'm aware of that. So I'll ask again. He was quiet for a moment. Then, because you are the first person in a long time who looked at me and said what they actually thought. Because your 12-year-old son fixed my porch step on his own initiative because he'd heard me say it needed doing. Because your 4-year-old daughter told me, very seriously, that the wire figure she made was a horse, and I should not confuse it with a dog. He paused. And because I have spent 7 days on your property, and I have not once been afraid to be exactly who I am. Clara looked at him for a long time. What happened to you? She said. Not gently, genuinely. His jaw tightened. That's a long story. I have time. Not today, he said. Not today. She nodded. She understood the shape of that answer, the thing it held off without refusing entirely. She'd used that same shape herself, more than once, in the months after Robert died when people asked how she was managing. All right, she said. She looked at the ledger. I'll take your terms, Mr. Blackwood. Ethan, he said. She looked up. If we're going to be in a business arrangement for the next 5 years, he said, and there was a slight tightness in his voice like a man who has planned one sentence and is hearing it come out slightly differently than intended, you might as well use my name. Ethan, she said. He wrote the new terms in the ledger. She signed. He signed. They shook hands across the desk, a business handshake, firm and brief, appropriate to the transaction. But when she stood to go, he stood too, and she had the sudden clear sense of 2 people standing at the edge of something large that neither of them had been expecting to find here, of all places, in a land office on a Tuesday morning in September. She walked out into the street. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the thin fall sunlight, people moving around her, and allowed herself to feel what she was actually feeling instead of managing it into something more useful. It was complicated. It was also, underneath the complication, something she recognized as hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind she'd been running on for 2 years, but the quieter and more dangerous kind. The kind that showed up when you'd stopped expecting it. She walked to her wagon, untied the horse, and drove home. The town, as it turned out, had opinions. She became aware of this gradually, the way you became aware of weather building, through small signs that accumulated before you could name what they were adding up to. The way Mrs. Garner paused when she saw Clara at the dry goods store and then chose a different aisle. The way the conversation at the post office shifted when she walked in on a Thursday morning, not stopping but changing pitch and subject with the practiced ease of people who'd been talking about something they didn't want the subject of to know. She heard specific things eventually she would have preferred not to. The most repeated version was that Clara Whitmore had made herself agreeable to Ethan Blackwood in order to keep her land, with the nature of agreeable left carefully unspecified so that each listener could fill it in according to their own imagination. This version was popular because it was simple, and it made everyone's roles clear. Ethan as a man fooled by a calculating woman, Clara as a woman desperate enough to use whatever she had. It was the kind of story that felt like it explained things. The more vicious version was Victor Harlan's contribution, delivered at a county commissioners' meeting that Clara had not attended, but two people reported back to her almost word for word. Harlan had suggested that Clara's children were living in conditions that warranted investigation by the county welfare board, that a woman alone, with no steady income and a history of debt, could not adequately provide for 5 children, that the appropriate resolution might involve placing the children with more stable families while Clara sorted out her situation. Margaret heard this from the daughter of one of the commissioners and came home white-faced and silent, which was worse than if she'd been crying. Clara heard the full account from Pete, who came to the farm on a Friday with the information and the expression of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have to. She stood at her kitchen counter and listened to all of it without moving. "How much support does he have?" she said when Pete finished. "On the board? 2, maybe 3 commissioners. Not a majority. But Harlan's been here a long time. He has ways of making things move that shouldn't." "Does Ethan know?" Pete was quiet just long enough. "He knows Harlan is pushing. He may not know the specifics about the children." She nodded. "Thank you, Pete." After he left, she stood at the window for a long time, watching Thomas and the twins working in the yard. The twins arguing about the correct way to stack firewood. While Thomas demonstrated with the patient authority she recognized as her own reflected back at her. Ruth was on the porch with her collection of objects, which had grown since the harvest to include a blue button and a piece of red yarn. Margaret had gone quiet somewhere in the house, processing in private the way she'd learned to do. 5 children. She thought about her mother's voice, which she hadn't thought about in a long time. The particular tone it took on when she was trying to convey something important and didn't have many words for it. "The ones who want to take from you will always find a reason. It's for your own good, Clara. Don't let them name the reason first." She went to find paper and a pen. She wrote to Ethan that evening. Not a long letter. She wasn't good at long letters, and what needed to be said was actually brief. She told him what Harlan had told the commissioners. She told him she was not asking for help, but that she believed he should have the information. She told him she was going to speak to a lawyer in the county seat the following week. She signed it Clara Whitmore and sent it with Thomas in the morning when he went to town for supplies. Thomas came back with a note that contained 4 lines. "I know what Harlan is doing. I've known Victor Harlan for 12 years and I am not surprised. Don't go to the county seat alone. I will go with you. E.B." She read it twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a while, the way you looked at something you hadn't expected. Thomas, who had read it over her shoulder with the total absence of guile that characterized his nosiness, said, "Are you going to let him?" "That's not—" "Yes," Clara said. "Yes, I think I am." Thomas considered this. "Good," he said, and went back outside. The night the storm came, she had no warning. She'd had 12 years of Montana weather, and she should have known better. The day had been still in the way that still days sometimes were. Too still. The air holding itself like it was deciding something. She'd noticed it in the afternoon and told herself it was nothing, and by 8 in the evening she knew she'd been wrong. It came from the northwest, which was the worst direction, and it came fast. She heard it in the trees first, a sound like something being drawn tight. And then the first real gust hit the house, and the windows flexed in their frames, and Ruth woke up crying, and Clara was already moving. She got the children together in the interior hall, which was the most sheltered part of the house. Candles, because the lamp was too dangerous in wind this unpredictable. Thomas held Ruth without being told to. Margaret had the twins sitting against the wall. Clara counted heads. 5. Then she looked toward the back of the house, toward the sound coming through the walls. A particular sound, irregular and sharp, and understood. The barn. The soft spot in the roof above the second stall. She'd patched it twice and it had held through the summer, but this was not summer wind. If that section went, the whole roof could follow, and the animals inside, the draft horse, the 2 milk cows, the chickens if they hadn't gone to the coop, would be at risk from falling timber. "Stay here," she told Thomas. "Do not move. Do not come outside." "Mama—" "Thomas." He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Those dark eyes that went so deep for a 12-year-old. And then he nodded. She grabbed her coat and went out. The wind hit her like something physical, like a hand, and she put her head down and moved across the yard in the direction of the barn. By feel as much as sight, because the lantern she'd grabbed on the way out was nearly useless in this. Rain had started, heavy and sideways, and the ground under her feet was already going soft. She got the barn door open. It fought her, pulling toward closed every time she moved it, and got inside and latched it behind her. The horses were terrified. The draft horse was stamping and throwing his head, and the two cows had pressed themselves into the corner of their stalls. She went to the horse first, one hand on his neck, talking low and steady, because that was what settled them. Not the words, but the sound. The human sound in the dark. Above her, something shifted in the roof. A crack. Then a groan. She had maybe minutes. She got the horse's lead on first and tied him to the support post in the center of the barn, which was the most structurally sound thing in the building. Then the cows. She was moving back toward the horse to check his knot when the south corner of the roof came down. Not all of it, not the whole section, just the edge, about 6 feet of beam and boarding, dropping at an angle and taking a section of wall with it. Cold, wet air poured through the gap. The horse screamed and pulled against his lead, and Clara was thrown sideways by the impact into the side of the stall and hit the wood with her shoulder in a way that sent a sheet of white pain up through her neck, and she grabbed the stall rail and held on, and didn't go down. The lantern had gone out. She stood in the dark, holding the rail, listening to the horse, and the rain, and the wind, and the particular terrible sound of a structure making its mind up about whether it was going to stand. Then the barn door opened. Light. A better lantern than hers, a good one, held high. A shape in the doorway, and then Ethan Blackwood was inside with her, latching the door behind him, holding the lantern up to see. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was completely level, which was somehow the most steadying thing. "My shoulder, I'm fine. The roof. I see it." He handed her the lantern and went to the horse. She watched him put both hands on the animal's face, thumbs along the bone below the eyes, the way you pressed on a scared horse to give it something to focus on, and he talked to it, low, continuous. She couldn't hear the words over the wind. The horse slowed his stamping, still terrified but managing it. "What are you doing here?" she said. "I saw the storm coming from the north road. I was about 4 miles out when it started." He didn't look away from the horse. "I rode for your place." 4 miles? The roof needs to be braced before more of it goes. Do you have timber, crossbeams, anything load-bearing? She was already moving. South wall, behind the feed bins. They worked in the way that two people work when there's no time to negotiate and the danger is clear and immediate, without discussion, reading each other's movements, adjusting. She handed things. He positioned them. He called for a particular type of brace. She knew where it was. The roof groaned twice more, and each time both of them went still for half a second, calculating, and then continued. The temporary brace went up. Not a repair. Nothing about it was a repair, but enough to stabilize the fallen section and stop further movement. The rain was getting in through the gap, and the wind was still muscling through every crack, but the structure held. The animals were unhappy, but upright. Ethan lowered his arms and looked at what they'd done. Then he looked at her. She was soaking wet. Her shoulder hurt in a way she was still not fully assessing. There was something on her cheek that she thought might be blood from a splinter, and there was mud on her boots to the ankle. She was aware, in some part of her mind that had not been engaged in the immediate crisis, that she looked absolutely terrible. She also did not particularly care. He was in worse shape, actually. He'd ridden hard through the storm before he got here, and his coat was saturated and his hair was plastered flat, and there was a long scratch along his jaw that was bleeding in the thin, interested way that face cuts sometimes did, slow and persistent. "Your face," she said. He touched his jaw, looked at his fingers. "Fence wire on the way in." "Come inside, I'll see to it." "The roof needs—" "I know what it needs. That's tomorrow's problem." She held his gaze. "Come inside." He followed her through the rain across the yard, and she was aware of him just behind her the whole way, and also aware that the awareness was not the calculation she'd learned to apply to men with power, the careful reading of intention and leverage and what they might want from her. It was something simpler and more frightening. The awareness of someone specific, this particular man, behind her, in the rain. The children were still in the hall. All 5 of them looked up when the door opened, and the relief on their faces at seeing her was immediate and complete, and almost more than she could stand. Ruth reached for her even before she was fully inside, and she caught the 4-year-old up, and held her, wet coat and all. Then Ruth looked past her shoulder at Ethan, dripping in the doorway. "You're bleeding," Ruth said, in the tone of someone identifying a problem that needs to be solved. "I know," Ethan said. "Mama will fix it," Ruth told him with absolute confidence. Clara looked at her daughter, then she looked at Ethan, standing in her hallway with mud on his boots and rain running off the brim of his hat and blood on his jaw, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled inventory-taking look, not the flat certainty of a man conducting business. Something open. Something that had not made up its mind yet what to do with itself. "Sit down," Clara said. "I'll get the kit." She put Ruth down and went to find the medicine box. The storm ran for 3 hours. It didn't weaken gradually. It simply stopped, with the abruptness of storms in that country, like something that had said what it needed to say and was finished. In the quiet after it, the world outside had the particular washed clarity of a place that had been thoroughly rearranged. Ethan sat at the kitchen table while she cleaned the cut on his jaw. The children had eventually been persuaded back to bed, all except Thomas, who sat at the far end of the table pretending to read and was transparently doing nothing of the kind. She worked with iodine and clean cloth. It stung. She could see him manage the response, the brief tightening, and she said, "Still," the way she said it to the children. "I'm still," he said. "You rode 4 miles in that storm," she said, working. 3.5. You could have stopped somewhere, waited it out. He was quiet for a moment. "I could have." She finished and sat back and looked at her work. The cut was shallow, would heal without much trouble. She became aware, in the sudden stillness, that she was close to him. Closer than she'd been outside of the work of the barn. And the circumstances of the barn had not left room to notice distance. This room did. She sat back further, put the lid on the medicine box. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I was afraid tonight, in the barn, when the roof came down." She said it plainly, not like a confession, like information she wanted him to have. "I've been managing this place for almost 2 years, and I've kept the fear very controlled, very separate. I know where it is at all times, and I know how to not let it run anything." She paused. "When that section came down and the lantern went out, I was afraid in a way I couldn't manage. For a moment." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I could see it when I came in. And then you were there and it stopped." The words went out into the quiet kitchen and she heard them land and didn't try to take them back. Thomas, at the end of the table, had stopped pretending to read. Ethan's hands were flat on the table. He had good hands, big, scarred, the hands of a man who had done actual work his whole life and hadn't tried to hide it with gloves. He looked at them for a moment, like he was reading something there. Then he looked up. "I've been doing everything alone for a long time," he said. For a long time. I built everything I have by making sure I never needed anyone to help me do it." He paused. "I told myself that was strength." "It isn't," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." Thomas very quietly set his book on the table and stood up and said, "I'm going to bed," and left the room with such careful deliberateness that she nearly laughed. She and Ethan sat in the kitchen in the after-storm quiet, the sound of water dripping from the eaves, the animals settling in the barn. Two people who had both spent a long time being strong in the particular lonely way that meant never letting the weight down. "Tell me the story," she said. "The long one. The one you said wasn't for today, 2 weeks ago in your office." He looked at her for a long moment. "It's late." "Yes." He didn't move. "Her name was Anne," he said. "I was 24. We were going to build something. Together. I had the land, I had the plans, I had this idea of what it was all going to be." He stopped. "She left when the first bad year came. Not for someone else. Just left. Said she hadn't signed up for struggle. That I was going to be doing this forever, and she didn't want to wait to find out if I was right." Clara was quiet. "She wasn't wrong, exactly," he said. "About the struggle. It was a long time before things turned, but what I took from it was, I decided the problem was that I'd let someone in close enough to leave." He looked at his hands again. "So I made sure not to do that anymore." "And then you came to my porch," Clara said. "And then I came to your porch," he said. The candle on the table was burning low. Outside, through the window, the clouds were breaking up, and the first stars were starting to show through the gaps. The barn would need real work in the morning. The south wall, the roof section, probably some of the interior supports. It was going to be expensive and difficult and time-consuming, and she didn't have money for materials yet, and he would probably offer to pay for them, and she was going to have a complicated feeling about that, the way she had complicated feelings about all of it. But that was tomorrow. "It's late," she said. "Yes." He stood, picked up his hat from where he'd hung it. She walked him to the door. He paused on the porch, the newly solid porch, with the step Thomas had fixed, and turned back. "Clara." She waited. "I'm glad I came tonight," he said. "Not for the barn, because I'm glad I was here." She looked at him in the star-beginning darkness, this complicated man who had ridden 3.5 miles through a Montana storm because he'd seen the sky and thought of her property, and she understood that he was saying something larger than the barn, and both of them knew it. "I'm glad too," she said. He nodded once, stepped off the porch. She heard his horse in the dark. He'd tied it to the post rather than the gate, which meant he'd expected to be here a while, which meant some part of him had known what this night was going to be before he'd gotten here. She went inside, checked on the children. Ruth was deeply asleep, one fist curled under her chin. The twins were a tangle of limbs and blankets. Margaret was on her back with one arm thrown over her eyes in the dramatic attitude of sleep that had been hers since infancy. Thomas's light was out, but she could hear he was awake by the quality of the silence, the alert, listening kind. She didn't say anything, just pulled his door partway closed. Back in her own room, sitting on the edge of the bed, she looked at the rectangle of window and the growing number of stars beyond it and thought about two things simultaneously: the barn that needed repairing and the man who had come through the storm to be there when it mattered. She was not afraid anymore. The fear had moved aside for something else, something she didn't have the right word for yet, but that felt, for the first time in a long time, like more than just the next hard thing to get through. She lay down. She did not sleep immediately. Outside, the last of the storm clouds pulled east and let the stars come through full and clear, and the air smelled like wet earth and cut wheat. And somewhere on the north road a horse was moving in the dark, carrying a man home who had remembered, for the first time in 12 years, what it felt like to be somewhere he wanted to be. The barn repairs began the morning after the storm, with Ethan arriving before 7, which was earlier than Clara had expected and later than she'd been awake. She'd been up since 5, moving through the damage assessment the way she moved through most hard things, methodically, with a list in her head, starting with the worst and working toward the manageable. The south wall had taken the most damage. 3 boards had been punched through entirely by the falling roof section, and the beam that had held the corner was cracked along its length in a way that made her stomach drop when she saw it in morning light. The temporary bracing she and Ethan had put up in the dark was holding, but only just. It had the particular strained look of something being asked to do more than it was built for. She was standing inside the barn making notes on a scrap of paper when she heard the wagon. Not just Ethan. Pete was with him, and a third man she didn't recognize, older, with a carpenter's belt and the unhurried movements of someone who assessed structural problems for a living. They pulled up, and Ethan got down and looked at her, and then at the barn, and then back at her, and she could see him taking inventory the same way she had. "How bad?" he said. "The corner beam is cracked. The south wall lost 3 boards. The roof section that came down took part of the rafter with it." She held up her paper. "I made a list." He took it, read it, handed it to the carpenter, whose name turned out to be Garrett, and Garrett went directly into the barn without a word and began his own assessment with the focus of a man who communicated primarily through direct examination of problems. "He's good," Ethan said, watching him. "Best framing carpenter in the county. He'll tell us what it actually needs rather than what it's easiest to fix." "How much will it cost?" "We'll talk about that after he's looked." "We'll talk about it now," Clara said, "because if it's beyond what I can manage, I need to know that before I get attached to a solution I can't afford." He looked at her. "I'm covering the materials." "No." "Clara," I said no. She kept her voice level. I understand what you're offering, and I know you mean it as a practical solution, and not as, I know it's not charity in your mind, but I cannot have you repairing my barn. Not right now. Not while the town is already—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. It would confirm every story Victor Harlan is telling. And I need the people of this county to see me standing on my own land, managing my own affairs, not being kept. The last word landed with more weight than she'd intended. She saw him receive it. He was quiet for a moment. The barn needs a load-bearing beam and 3 wall sections minimum. Garrett's labor isn't cheap. Tell me the number and I'll tell you what I can manage. You just made your first payment to me 2 days ago. You don't have— Tell me the number, Ethan. He looked at her. Then he looked away. At the barn. At the blue October sky above the damaged roof line. At some private calculation he was running. The materials will run $40, maybe $50. Garrett charges by the day, so it depends on how long it takes. I can pay for the materials, she said. I'll negotiate the labor with Garrett directly, and I'll pay you back for whatever advance you put out, against the debt terms we agreed. That's not necessary. Yes, it is. He looked back at her, and there was something in his expression she had started to learn. The slight compression around the eyes when he was being argued out of something he wanted to do but couldn't find a legitimate counter to. He didn't enjoy it, but he was beginning, she thought, to respect it. All right, he said. Thank you. You don't have to thank me for agreeing with you. I know, she said. I'm thanking you for arguing first. It would have been harder to trust if you'd simply agreed. He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted. A small thing, almost nothing, except she was learning to read the small things. He almost smiled. That is a very strange thing to say. I'm a very strange woman, she said, and went to talk to Garrett. The repair took 3 days. Garrett was efficient and spoke in measurements and load tolerances and didn't seem to require conversation, which Clara found restful. She fed him lunch, and he thanked her and went back to work. The new corner beam went in on the second day, and she stood watching it lifted into place with the particular relief of seeing something structural made whole again. Ethan came each day. He didn't work the repair. That was Garrett's territory, and both men understood this without discussion. But he came in the mornings and walked the property and found other things to do. He fixed the water pump without being asked. The pump had stuck every cold morning for 8 months, and she'd developed a technique involving a specific pressure and a particular angle of approach that she'd come to think of as hers, almost proprietary, and she came out on the second morning to find it moving freely and smoothly and felt a brief contradictory irritation. Grateful for the fix, oddly nostalgic for the familiar struggle. She told him this. He stared at her. You're annoyed that I fixed your pump. I'm not annoyed. I'm noting a feeling. The feeling is annoyance. The feeling is complicated. She paused. Thank you for fixing it. He shook his head in a way that was so close to fond it made her look away. On the third day, Margaret pulled Clara aside in the kitchen, which was the signal that something was coming that Margaret had been holding for a while. She was 10 years old, and she processed things the way deep water processed things, slowly, internally, and then all at once when the pressure built enough. Are you and Mr. Blackwood? She stopped, started again. Is he going to be here a lot? Clara set down the dish she was drying. What are you asking exactly, Maggie? Margaret looked at the table, then at the window. Then, because she was Robert's daughter as much as Clara's, she looked directly at her mother. I'm asking if he's going to matter. Because he's here every day and you talk to him differently than you talk to other people, and Ruth asks about him in the mornings before he's even arrived. Clara was quiet for a moment. She picked the dish back up, set it down again. I don't know yet, she said honestly. That means yes, Margaret said. It means I don't know yet. Margaret considered this. I like him, she said, in the careful tone of someone making an admission that costs something. He listens when I talk. Most adults don't. They're just waiting for you to finish. Clara looked at her daughter, this precise, perceptive child who had been watching the world with her full attention since she was 2 years old. I know, she said. He does that. Papa did that too, Margaret said. The kitchen was very quiet. Yes, Clara said. He did. Margaret picked up a dish and started drying it alongside her, and they finished the washing without saying anything else, which was its own kind of conversation. Victor Harlan moved on a Wednesday. Clara got no warning this time. She was in the east field with Thomas, checking the fencing along the property line, when she saw the county wagon come up the road. Not Harlan himself. He was too careful for that. He sent others to do the visible parts. Two men she didn't recognize, and a woman in a dark dress who was, as she announced upon climbing down from the wagon, a representative of the Calhoun County Welfare Board. Her name was Mrs. Deacon. She had a notebook and a manner that managed to be both brisk and apologetic, the combination of a person who found her job unpleasant but was good at it. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I'm here to conduct a welfare assessment of the children in your household. It's a routine." "It's not routine," Clara said. "It's Victor Harlan." Mrs. Deacon's expression shifted fractionally. "I'm not at liberty to—" "You don't have to confirm it." Clara wiped her hands on her skirt. "Come inside." She brought them in. She made coffee because the performance of normalcy was its own argument, and she knew it. She called the children, who appeared in various states of their mourning, Will with dirt on his knees, James with a book tucked under his arm, Ruth still in her second-best dress because the best one was drying on the line. Margaret came in from the kitchen where she'd been helping with bread, flour on her hands, and looked at the strangers with the quiet, appraising look she had. Thomas stood near the door. He'd understood immediately what this was, and the set of his jaw was so precisely what Clara's looked like in certain moments that she could see Mrs. Deacon register the resemblance. The assessment lasted an hour and a half. Mrs. Deacon asked questions. She looked at the pantry. Clara had been to town 3 days ago, and it was reasonably stocked, not full, but real. She looked at the children's sleeping areas. She noted the repaired porch step, the newly functional water pump, the barn in visible process of being restored. She spoke to each of the older children individually in the way that said she was following a protocol rather than pursuing a conviction. James told her, with the earnest cooperation of an 8-year-old who did not understand why anyone needed to ask, that they had oatmeal most mornings, and sometimes eggs, and that Mama made beef stew when there was beef, and that Mr. Blackwood had fixed the pump, and Pete had helped with the wheat, and that the barn roof had blown off in the storm, but it was being fixed. Clara, standing near the kitchen doorway, heard this and closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Deacon wrote in her notebook. Will, who was subtler than James in the way that one twin was always subtler than the other, added that they were all fine and their mother worked very hard and they didn't need anyone to worry about them, thank you. Ruth told Mrs. Deacon that her horse, the wheat stalk figure, now reinforced with a piece of wire, was named Button, and that Mr. Blackwood had said it was a very good horse. Mrs. Deacon wrote that down too. When the assessment was done, Clara walked her to the door. The two men with the wagon had waited outside, which she'd noted and appreciated. Standing in her yard with countymen was exactly the kind of image she couldn't afford the neighbors to see. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mrs. Deacon said at the door. She paused. Clara waited. "I want you to know. I write what I observe. I don't write what I'm told to find." She looked at her notebook. "What I've observed today is 5 children who are fed, sheltered, and clearly loved, who speak about their home without fear." She looked up. "The report will reflect that." Clara held the door. "Thank you," she said. "The man who requested the investigation. I know who he is." "He's not going to stop with one report," Mrs. Deacon said quietly, the way a woman said something she couldn't say in her official capacity, but was saying anyway. "He's very determined." "So am I," Clara said. Mrs. Deacon nodded. She went to the wagon. Clara stood on the porch and watched until the wagon had rounded the bend and disappeared before she turned and went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed for a moment. Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Is it over?" "For today," she said. He came in and sat across from her. The twins followed and sat on either side of their brother. Margaret came from the kitchen with flour still on her hands. Ruth climbed into Clara's lap without being invited, settled against her chest, and was still. They sat there, all of them, in the October light. "He's going to do it again," Thomas said. Not a question. "Yes." "What do we do?" Clara looked at her children arranged around the table, this particular collection of people who had come from her and from Robert, and from everything they'd built together, and she felt something solidify in her, the way a decision sometimes solidified when you stopped trying to think your way into it and just recognized what was already true. "We go to the county seat," she said. "We talk to a lawyer. We get ahead of it instead of waiting for the next one." She paused. "And I'm going to ask Ethan to come with me, not to speak for me, to be there." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "Good," he said. For the second time in 3 weeks, he used that single word with that particular weight, and she understood that he meant something larger than the word itself. She sent a message to Ethan that afternoon. By the next morning, he had sent back 3 lines: the name of the best land attorney in the county seat, a time he could have a wagon ready, and the question of whether she wanted him to speak with the attorney first to explain the situation or whether she preferred to do it herself. She wrote back, "I'll do it myself, but I want you there." He arrived at dawn on Friday with a good wagon and 2 horses instead of 1, because the road to the county seat was 40 miles, and he'd thought about the return trip in the dark. She saw this and understood it as a language he was speaking: practical, concrete, the love language of someone who showed care through preparation rather than declaration. She was not ready to use the word love, even in her own mind, but she was aware of its approximate location. The children were left in Margaret's charge. Margaret had been briefed, was 12 going on 35, and had a list of what to do in 12 different scenarios written in Clara's handwriting on the kitchen table. Thomas had been given authority over the twins, which he exercised with the gravity of a monarch. Ruth had been promised a new button for her collection when Clara returned, which seemed to satisfy the 4-year-old's requirement for acknowledgement that this trip was important. The drive to the county seat took most of the day. The road was still soft in places from the storm, and they had to slow down twice where water had cut across the track. They talked more on that drive than they had in all the previous weeks combined, which surprised her and probably surprised him too, though he expressed surprise less obviously than she did. He told her about the early years, the borrowed horse, the first terrible winter when he'd worked a lumber camp to eat, the way the land had looked the first morning he'd seen it, and known he was going to buy it regardless of the cost. He told her about his parents, briefly, without much detail, in the way of someone who has processed a thing well enough to mention it, but not well enough to expand on it. His father had been a difficult man. His mother had been absent in the particular way that some people were absent while physically present. He had learned early to rely on himself, and had turned that into a philosophy that had taken 12 years and a debt call on a homestead in September to begin revising. She told him things too, about Ohio, about her own mother's voice and the things it had said, about the first year of marriage to Robert, which had been genuinely good. She wanted him to know that, wanted to be accurate about it, that Robert had been a good man who loved her and had made real mistakes alongside real love, and that she held both of those things without needing to resolve them against each other. About the morning she'd found him and the fog that came after, and the slow, grinding process of climbing out of it. "How did you do it?" he said. "The first year, alone." "One morning at a time," she said. "Literally. I stopped thinking past that day, past that task. I told myself I just had to get through today, and then tomorrow was tomorrow's problem." She was quiet for a moment. "It's not a philosophy I'd recommend for the long term, but for survival, it works." He drove and didn't say anything for a bit. Then, "I did the same thing after Anne left. I just went to work. Every day I just went to work and I didn't think past the work. And it made you very successful and very alone," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "Does it ever stop?" She glanced at him. The impulse to just keep your head down, keep working, not look up. He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't rush answers. "I don't know yet," he said. "Ask me in a year." She looked back at the road. The hills in the distance were starting to show their fall colors, the aspens going yellow-gold against the dark green of the pine. "A year," she said, like she was measuring the word. "If you're willing," he said, and his voice was careful in the particular way of someone who means more than the surface of the sentence and knows it. She was quiet for long enough that she felt him become uncertain, which was a new thing. This man who was never uncertain. She could feel it without looking at him, a slight change in the quality of his presence. "I'm willing," she said. He didn't respond with words. He shifted the reins slightly in his hands, and the horses moved on, and the road unrolled ahead of them, and that was enough. The attorney's name was Aldous Crane, and he was exactly the kind of lawyer the county seat produced, competent, unsentimental, with a precise understanding of how power worked, and a personal willingness to work against it when properly retained. He listened to Clara lay out the situation. She'd organized it before she walked in. Dates, documents, the terms of the debt, the welfare assessment, Harlan's involvement with the commissioners. She presented it cleanly, without editorial, and watched Crane make notes. When she finished, he looked at her over his glasses, then at Ethan, who was sitting to her left and had said nothing. "You're Blackwood," he said. "Yes." And you're here in what capacity?" "He's here because I asked him to be," Clara said. Crane looked back at her. Made a decision. Harlan's filing for welfare review isn't a legal action. It's administrative, and one clean assessment will usually end it. The issue is if he gets 2 or 3 bad reports in a row, or if he can convince the board that there's an ongoing pattern. One woman with a debt history and no local family can be made to look unstable on paper, even if the reality is otherwise. He tapped his pen on his desk. What you need is documentation, proof of stable income, property maintenance, community standing. The new debt terms work in your favor. It shows the creditor is confident enough in your reliability to extend a 5-year arrangement. He looked at Ethan. "I assume you'd be willing to provide a written statement to that effect?" "Yes," Ethan said. "I also need character witnesses, people in the county who know Mrs. Whitmore and her children and are willing to put their names on paper." Clara thought of Pete, who had stayed to help with the threshing without being asked, of Mrs. Deacon's careful eyes and the way she'd warned her at the door, of the farmers she'd bought seed from, the families at the schoolhouse who'd watched Thomas grow into the boy he was now. "I can get them," she said. "The third piece is harder," Crane said. He set down his pen. "Victor Harlan has been acquiring land in this county for 20 years through a combination of debt purchase, legal pressure, and, in at least 2 cases I know of, outright fraud that was never fully proven. If you want to stop him permanently rather than just defend yourself this round, you need to know which one he's using with you and find the evidence." He looked at them both. "The debt your husband took out, where did it originate?" Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan said slowly, "I purchased the debt from Calhoun Savings. Standard practice. The original loan was from '87. Who handled the loan at the bank?" "I'd have to check the documents." "Check them," Crane said. "Because Harlan has a relationship with Calhoun Savings that goes back 15 years. He sits on their advisory board." He let that sit. "I'm not saying the original debt was manufactured. I'm saying it's worth understanding how it got to where it got." The office was quiet. Clara felt the thing she'd been moving toward for weeks shift and settle into a new shape. "He wanted the land from the beginning," she said, "even before Robert died." "Almost certainly," Crane said. "And when Robert died and the debt was still outstanding, he waited. He let the bank hold it long enough for it to look legitimate, and then he arranged for it to be sold to someone else so that he'd have distance from the actual foreclosure. Because if Ethan took the land, Harlan buys it from me," Ethan said. The words came out flat and cold. "He'd already approached me, last spring. I turned him down. I didn't understand. I didn't know about this property specifically." "He was playing both ends," Clara said. "He was playing every end," Crane said, "which is how men like that operate." He picked up his pen again. "I need those loan documents, original copies if you can get them. And I need to know if there was any communication between Harlan and the bank around the time the debt was sold." Ethan stood. His jaw had the particular tightness she'd come to recognize as controlled anger. Not hot anger, the cold kind, the kind that moved deliberately. "I have the documents at the office. I can have them here by Monday." "Monday," Crane said. He looked at Clara. "Don't let anyone take anything from that property. If Harlan sends anyone else, county official, sheriff's deputy, anyone, you send for me immediately." "I will." "And Mrs. Whitmore." He looked at her directly, with the candid look of a man about to say something pragmatic that might sting. "Your position is stronger than it looks on paper, but it is still vulnerable. A woman alone with children and a debt history is what the law sees on first glance, even if the reality is different." He paused. "If there is anyone in your life who is willing to stand publicly and formally on your side, not just a business statement, but a real, visible, documented position, now would be the time to ask." He was not looking at Ethan when he said it. He was looking at Clara. But the sentence had a direction to it that was impossible to miss. Clara looked at her hands. Then she looked up. "I understand," she said. They left Crane's office and stood on the street in the late afternoon, the county seat moving around them with the ordinary business of a Friday. She could feel Ethan thinking beside her, could feel it the way you could feel a room change temperature. "He's right," Ethan said. "I know." Clara. He turned to face her. Right there on the main street of the county seat with people walking past and the autumn sun going sideways. I want to be clear about what I'm asking, because I have been unclear about things for long enough. I'm not offering to be a legal shield. I'm not trying to rescue you. I know you don't need that, and I know you don't want it. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking if you'll let me be part of this. Genuinely. The farm, the debt, the children, the next year, and the year after that. Not managing it for you. Alongside you. She looked at him. The afternoon light was flat and honest, and there was nothing cinematic about the street, nothing soft about it, just the ordinary grit of a working town, and this man with the scar along his jaw from a fence wire in a storm that he'd ridden into because he'd seen the sky and thought of her. What are you asking specifically? She said, because she needed to hear it precisely. I'm asking you to marry me, he said. Eventually, when you're ready, if you ever are. And in the meantime, I'm asking to be there. Every day. Not as your creditor. Not as a neighbor. As the man who came to your porch to take your land and instead... He stopped. Clara, I don't know how else to say it except to say it plain. I don't want to leave. The street was loud in the sudden awareness of her own heartbeat. She thought about what Margaret had said. That means yes. She thought about Thomas and his careful 12-year-old. Okay, that meant more than the word. She thought about Ruth asking about him in the mornings before he'd arrived. She thought about herself on the porch the first night, watching his horses disappear down the road, pressing her hand flat against the wood of the door. I'm not ready to say yes to the eventually part, she said. I know. But the everyday part? She looked at him. Yes. Stay. He nodded. Something in his face, not softening exactly, more like the thing that had been held very tight for a very long time, finding the first real room to breathe. We should start back before dark, she said. Yes, he said. They walked to the wagon. He helped her up without making a production of it. And she took his hand to climb, and when she was seated, he held her hand for one moment longer than the climbing required, and then let go, and climbed up on his own side, and they drove west toward home in the long October light. The road was still soft in places. The return trip would take as long as the coming. She had 40 miles of road in a county full of people who thought they knew her situation, and a lawyer with documents and a man who wanted to stay, and 5 children at home with Margaret managing the supper. She was not afraid. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without her fully noticing when, she had stopped waiting for the ground to fall away and had started standing on it instead. The horses moved on. The hills came down into evening. Ethan drove and didn't fill the silence with anything it didn't need, and she sat beside him and let the miles go past, and held the words he'd said. I don't want to leave. Not as a promise that could break, but as a fact about the present, which was the only place she'd learned to trust anyway. That was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough. They got back to Willow Creek after dark, which Clara had expected, and the lamp was still burning in the kitchen window, which she had not. Margaret had waited up. She didn't say so. She was in bed when Clara looked in, eyes closed, breathing with the deliberate evenness of a child pretending to sleep. But the lamp had been trimmed and the kitchen cleaned and a plate of biscuits covered with a cloth left on the counter. And Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at all of this, and felt the particular ache of a mother recognizing how much her daughter understood about the world without anyone having to explain it. She ate one of the biscuits standing at the counter in the dark. It was cold and slightly dense in the middle, where the oven had been uneven, and it was also the best thing she'd eaten all day. Ethan had stayed only long enough to see her inside and check that the barn was holding before he'd driven on. He'd be back in the morning, they both knew it without saying it, with the loan documents from his office that Crane needed, and the rest of the work would begin. But the drive back had been its own separate thing, 40 miles of dark road, and the conversation they'd had, and the words still settling somewhere in her chest like weight finding its right position. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She didn't sleep immediately, but the quality of her wakefulness was different from the kind she'd been carrying for 2 years. It wasn't the vigilant, listening kind, the kind that was always tracking for the next thing that could go wrong. It was the kind that came after a long day of real work, the body wanting to rest and the mind still warm with the day's events, not anxious, just present. She thought about what Crane had said, about what Ethan had said on the street. She thought about the loan documents and what they might show, and whether Harlan had been more deliberate in his scheming than even Crane suspected, and what the next weeks would require of her in terms of patience and strategy and the particular kind of courage that wasn't dramatic. Not the courage of a storm or a confrontation, but the slower courage of showing up to difficult rooms and staying in them until the work was done. She was good at that kind of courage. She'd been practicing it for years. She fell asleep somewhere around midnight, which was earlier than she'd managed in months. Ethan arrived the next morning with the loan documents in a leather satchel, and Pete behind him with lumber for the final barn repairs, and a look on his face that said he'd been told the general shape of things, and was keeping his opinions about it inside his own head, which was why Clara had always liked Pete. She made coffee and spread the documents on the kitchen table, and they went through them together, she and Ethan, while the children moved around them with the learned ability to exist around adult business that children in working households developed early. Thomas circled twice, pretending he wasn't reading over their shoulders. She didn't stop him. He was 12, and what was in those documents was going to be his inheritance too, one way or another. The original loan paperwork was standard: the amount, the collateral, the interest rate, the terms of default. It was the transfer documents that mattered. The debt had been sold by Calhoun Savings to an intermediary holding company called Western Land Partners in January of the previous year, nearly a full year after Robert's death, and then sold again to Ethan 3 months after that. Western Land Partners, Clara said. I don't know that name, Ethan said, but his voice had the quality it got when he was saying something carefully. Yes, you do, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I have a suspicion. I want to verify it before I say it. Then verify it. He spent the rest of the morning at the table, working through his own records, while Clara helped Pete with the barn and kept the children managed and did the ordinary work of a morning on a farm in October. Around midday, Ethan came to the barn door. His expression was the controlled cold that she now knew meant genuine anger being kept below the boiling point. Western Land Partners, he said. It's a holding company registered in Helena. 2 principals. One of them is a man named Garrett Folsom, who is Victor Harlan's brother-in-law. Clara set down the hammer she'd been holding. So Harlan created the vehicle to purchase the debt and then sold it to you without telling you where it came from? Yes. And when you turned down his offer to buy the land from you, he started the welfare board pressure because he still needed the land out of your hands, and if I wasn't going to be his tool willingly, the alternative was to force my hand by making the property legally complicated enough that I'd want to be rid of it. Pete, who had been working quietly on the roof bracing, said nothing, which was the particular discretion of a man who understood when to be invisible. He needed you to either take the land fast, force the foreclosure before the crop came in, or to get so tangled up in welfare investigations that you'd have no choice but to accept whatever terms he offered, Ethan said. I was supposed to be the mechanism. I didn't know I'd been set up. That's why he started the rumors. About you and me. Clara looked at him. He needed you to pull back, prove you still had business sense. And if you pulled back, I lost the crop, I couldn't make the payment, you'd foreclose, and then he'd buy it from you. Yes. Except you didn't pull back. He met her eyes. No. She picked up the hammer again. Take everything to Crane, today if you can. I'm leaving within the hour. Ethan. He was already turning. She waited until he looked back at her. When you talk to Crane, make sure he understands that we need this finished, not slowed down, not managed into a longer process. Finished. Harlan is going to keep pressing until something stops him completely. I know. What will stop him completely? He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear him making a decision about how much to say. If the holding company transfer can be proven fraudulent, if we can show he used Western Land Partners to obscure his involvement in manipulating a debt he'd engineered, that's not a civil matter, that's fraud, criminal fraud. Can it be proven? I think so. Crane will know better. He paused. It means depositions. It means Harlan coming at you harder before it's resolved, because men like that increase pressure when they feel it closing in. I know what that means. Clarity, I said I know. She looked at him steadily. I've been handling hard things for a long time. This one I won't be handling alone. Something in his face, that same barely there movement she'd learned to read, and he nodded and left. She turned back to the barn. Pete was adjusting a roof brace with precise, unhurried attention. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They worked. November came in cold, and the world narrowed to the familiar winter radius of the homestead, the distance you could reasonably travel and return from in a day, the work that the short light allowed, the particular discipline of making things last through a Montana winter, with 5 children and a property that was still healing from the storm. But it was different from the previous November, quantifiably, measurably different. Ethan came every other day at minimum, and sometimes every day, and sometimes he stayed for supper, and sometimes he stayed after supper to sit at the kitchen table while Clara worked on accounts, and he worked on his own paperwork, and the children were in various stages of the evening, homework and argument, and the twins' recurring negotiation about who owned the better blanket. He was not filling Robert's place. She was clear about that in her own mind, and she thought he was clear about it in his. He was making his own place, which was a different thing. Slower. Irregular around the edges in the way that real things were. Thomas had stopped watching him with the careful evaluating look and had started just talking to him, which Clara noticed the first time it happened, and then tried to stop noticing because watching it directly felt like it would disturb something delicate. They talked about cattle, mostly, and about the property's east fence line, which Thomas had strong opinions about, and occasionally about the nature of debt and land ownership, which were topics Thomas had developed more understanding of than any 12-year-old should need to. Will and James treated him with the pragmatic acceptance of 8-year-old boys who had identified him as a person who would occasionally help with things that needed lifting and who did not talk to them like they were small. This was sufficient qualification. Margaret remained precise and watchful, the way she was with everything. She asked him questions sometimes, direct ones, the kind Clara recognized as tests that Margaret applied to everyone she was deciding about. What did he think was the hardest part of running a cattle operation? Did he think winter wheat was worth trying on the south slope? She listened to the answers with her full attention, and Clara could see her deciding. Ruth had no ambivalence whatsoever. She had adopted him with the total certainty of a 4-year-old who had made up her mind. She brought him things to examine, rocks, bugs, the button collection which had grown to 11, a bird feather of particularly good quality. She told him things at length, with the assumption that he wanted to know. And he listened with the same quality of actual attention that Margaret had identified and Clara had noticed long before that. One evening, Clara looked up from her accounts and found Ruth asleep against Ethan's arm, her small face tipped sideways against his sleeve, one fist curled under her chin. He hadn't moved. He was still working on whatever papers he'd brought. He was holding himself very still in the way of a person who has an animal or a child resting against them and has made the private decision not to disturb it. Clara looked at this for a moment. Then she looked back at her accounts. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't have to. Crane moved faster than she'd expected. By mid-November, he had depositions from 3 people who'd had dealings with Western Land Partners, all of which pointed to the same thing, a pattern of Harlan using the company to purchase distressed debts, obscure his involvement, and then pressure the new creditor into a position where selling to Harlan was the easiest resolution. The Whitmore debt was not the first time. It was at least the 4th. The difference this time was that Ethan Blackwood was not the kind of man who became the easiest resolution without fighting. The county attorney was a man named Birch, who had been in his position for 8 years and had a reputation for being thorough without being ambitious, which Crane said was actually useful because it meant he wouldn't overreach and lose the case on a technicality. Birch reviewed Crane's materials over 2 weeks, and at the end of November issued a formal investigation notice to Victor Harlan, which meant that everything Harlan had been doing in the shadows now had official light on it. Harlan's response was immediate, and precisely what Ethan had predicted. He sent a second welfare board request in the first week of December. This one was more formal. Specific allegations, references to the debt history, language about the instability of the household. Mrs. Deacon came back, and this time she brought a colleague. Clara had been expecting it. She'd prepared for it the way she'd prepared for the harvest, by understanding what she was working with and making sure everything that could be documented was documented. She had Crane's letter establishing her legal standing. She had Ethan's written statement regarding the debt terms and her compliance with them. She had letters from Pete, from Hendricks at the grain exchange, from the school teacher who'd had Thomas and Margaret for the past 2 years, from 3 neighboring families who'd known the Whitmore household since Robert was alive. She had Margaret's bread on the table, which had improved considerably since the fall. and the twins doing homework at the kitchen table with the genuine focus of boys who'd been told to look like they were doing homework and had taken the instructions seriously, and Ruth showing Mrs. Deacon's colleague the button collection with the thorough explanatory tour she gave everyone, and Thomas sitting near the window reading an actual book because Thomas genuinely read books and needed no performance. Mrs. Deacon looked at the documentation Clara laid out. She looked at the children. She looked at the house, which was clean in the particular honest way that working houses were clean. Not staged, not perfect, but cared for. She wrote in her notebook. Her colleague, who was younger and had a more careful manner, spent a long time with Ruth and her buttons. When they were done and standing at the door, Mrs. Deacon said, "This is the second assessment, Mrs. Whitmore. A second clean report significantly limits what the board can do on future requests without new evidence." "I know," Clara said. "Is there anything you'd like noted specifically in the report regarding your circumstances or plans?" Clara looked at her. "Note that this household has a signed 5-year debt repayment agreement with its primary creditor, who has also provided a formal character reference. Note that the property has been fully maintained and improved since the debt agreement was established. And note," she paused, "note that I am not a woman in crisis. I am a woman who has been managing difficult circumstances with full competence for 2 years. Those are different things, and I'd like the board to know I know the difference." Mrs. Deacon wrote it down. Word for word, Clara thought. She closed her notebook. "I'll note all of it," she said. After they left, Thomas put down his book and looked at his mother. "That's the last one," he said. "Maybe," Clara said. It felt like the last one. She looked at her son, this 12-year-old who had developed an instinct for turns in things that she recognized as a quality that would serve him his whole life if he didn't let it make him too careful. "I think so too," she said. "But we wait and see." He nodded, went back to his book. Victor Harlan was formally charged with fraud in the second week of December. The charge was specific: manipulation of debt instruments through undisclosed related party transactions, and it named Western Land Partners and its principals and the 4 documented cases, of which the Whitmore debt was the most recent and the most traceable. Clara heard about it from Ethan, who had been at the county seat when Birch filed the papers and had ridden back with the news in the early afternoon. He came into the kitchen and told her directly, without preamble, which was his way. She was at the counter cutting vegetables. She set down the knife, stood with her hands flat on the counter for a moment. "Is it over?" she said. "The investigation isn't. The legal process will take months, maybe a year." He paused. "But his ability to move against you specifically, the welfare board, any further pressure on the debt, any attempt to acquire the property, all of it is frozen while he's under investigation. His lawyers will make sure he doesn't do anything that looks like retaliation. So he can't touch us. Not without making his situation considerably worse." She stood at the counter, the vegetables half cut, the ordinary interrupted business of a December afternoon. Outside, through the window, she could see the snow that had started an hour ago, light and dry, the first real snow of the season settling onto the cleared stubble of the east field. She felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not relief exactly. Relief was what you felt when something bad stopped happening, and this was more like the first full breath after a long time of breathing shallow. The recognition of space that hadn't been there before. She picked up the knife and finished cutting the vegetables. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." "You did the—" "Don't tell me I did it myself," she said. "I know what I did. I'm also thanking you." He was quiet. She could hear him behind her, and she didn't turn around. "You're welcome, Mug," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it sometimes had, the stripped-down sound of a man who has removed all the protective layers and is just saying the thing plainly. She finished the vegetables and started the pot. Christmas that year was small and imperfect and entirely itself. Ethan came for the day. This had not been formally proposed. It had simply become evident over the preceding weeks that it was what was going to happen, the way some things become evident when the circumstances build toward them without anyone having to say anything. He arrived in the morning with a paper parcel that turned out to contain candy sticks for the children, and separately, a small book of pressed Montana wildflowers that someone had clearly put effort into collecting and pressing and binding, which he handed to Clara without explanation. She looked at it for a moment. then at him. "Where did you find this?" she said. "I made it," he said, with the flat brevity of a man who has done something that cost him something and is not going to discuss the cost. She looked at it again. The flowers were carefully pressed, labeled in small, precise handwriting: shooting star, blue flax, Indian paintbrush. She turned it over in her hands. "When?" "Over the summer, before—" He stopped. "I didn't know who it was for exactly. I've been pressing flowers from this valley for 3 years. I thought someone should have them." She understood. In that way she'd come to understand him, that this was a large thing said sideways, and she didn't make him say it more directly. She held the book and said, "It's the best thing anyone has given me in a very long time," and meant it fully and moved on, because that was also a kindness. The day was noisy and irregular. The twins fought about something in the afternoon, and the argument escalated to a level that required Clara's intervention and the temporary confiscation of one wooden toy horse, which caused James to make his feelings known at considerable volume. Ruth developed a strong conviction around 2 in the afternoon that Ethan's coat pocket was the best place in the house to store her button collection, and he walked around for the rest of the day with 11 buttons in his pocket and didn't complain. Margaret made a pie that was slightly underdone in the center and insisted on serving it anyway, which Clara allowed because some lessons were better learned through experience than instruction. Ethan ate 2 slices of the pie without comment. After supper, with the younger children in bed and Thomas reading by the fire with the focused absorption that was his particular evening mode, Ethan and Clara sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them and talked in the comfortable way they'd developed, not filling silence, but occupying it together, speaking when there was something to say. "Next year," he said. She waited. "The South Slope," he said. "Thomas has good instincts about the winter wheat. If we rotated the east field to hay and tried wheat on the South Slope, with the right timing—" "We," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "We." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I've been thinking about what you asked me in the county seat," she said. "About the eventually part." He was very still. "I'm not ready today," she said. "I want to be precise about that. Not because of you, not because I have doubts about who you are or what I want, but because I have 5 children and a debt and a farm, and I've been making decisions under pressure since February of last year, and I don't want the biggest decision I'll ever make to be one more thing I did under pressure." "I understand," he said. "I don't think you're pressure," she said quickly, because that wasn't what she meant, and she wanted to be accurate. "You're the opposite of pressure. You're the first thing in 2 years that has felt like solid ground." She pressed her lips together, looking for the right word. "But I need to stand on it for a while before I build on it. Do you understand the difference?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow had resumed, soft against the window. "Yes," he said. "I understand. You'll wait." "Clara." He looked at her with those dark eyes that had started as inventory and become something else entirely. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded. She believed him, not with the credulous belief of someone who needed to believe it, but with the grounded belief of a woman who had watched a man's actions over weeks and found them consistent with his words, which was a much more reliable measure. "More coffee?" she said. "Please," he said. She got up and poured it, and they sat in the winter kitchen with the snow outside and Thomas turning pages by the fire. And it was imperfect and complicated and real, which was exactly what she had needed it to be. Spring came in the way. Montana springs came, suddenly and with argument, warm days interrupted by late cold snaps, the ground softening and then firming again, the animals confused and the farmers checking the sky with the particular squinting assessment of people who have learned not to trust the good days too quickly. But it came. The east field was prepared for hay, the south slope for the winter wheat that Thomas had been planning on paper since December, with a meticulousness that Ethan had noted and taken seriously, which had produced in Thomas a visible pride he was attempting to manage with more composure than he actually felt. He was 13 in April, and he carried his new age with the slight extra gravity of a boy who had decided this was a significant threshold. Clara signed the formal agreement with Crane's office in March. Not a new legal action, but a protective filing that established her standing on the property in unambiguous terms, regardless of what happened with Harlan's case, which was moving through the legal system with the deliberate pace of county proceedings. It cost money she'd budgeted for carefully, and she paid it without regret. Ethan paid the final fees for Garrett's barn work out of the shared account they'd established. Not personal money, but the formal business arrangement she'd insisted on, the one where his contributions to the property went against the debt balance in documented, witnessed increments. She had insisted on this structure not because she didn't trust him, but because she trusted herself. And the version of herself she trusted was the one who understood the importance of names on paper. He'd agreed without argument. He'd even called it sensible, which had made her almost laugh. The debt balance in March was $190, ahead of schedule by 11 months, because the hay crop from the East Field had been good in the fall and she'd sold it well and applied the surplus. Crane's assistant had sent her the updated ledger and she'd sat with it for a long time, running her finger along the numbers. $190 from $540. She'd thought about Robert when she'd received the letter, not with the grief fog of the first year, but more clearly, the way you thought about someone once you'd had time to understand them more fully than you could while they were there. He had been a good man who loved her and trusted hope more than numbers, and had made a mistake that he'd carried alone when he should have shared it with her. She'd forgiven him for the carrying alone long ago. She understood it, understood the particular pride of a man who'd brought his family west on a vision and didn't want to be the one who said the vision had problems. She wished she could tell him about the weed on the south slope. He would have liked that idea. On a Saturday in late April, a year and a half after Ethan Blackwood had ridden through her gate with a legal document and the expression of a man who had already decided how things would end, Clara Whitmore said yes. It wasn't a dramatic moment. That was the thing she noticed most about it afterward. How undramatic it was. How thoroughly it failed to resemble the kind of moment that stories usually made of these things. They were walking the south slope in the early morning, checking the wheat seedlings that Thomas had planted in February, the ground still cold enough to see their breath, and Ethan said, carefully, with the particular quality of a man who had been patient for a long time and was asking one more time, not because he expected the answer to be different, but because it was time to ask again, I want to ask you again, about the eventually part. She stopped walking, looked at the seedlings coming up in their careful rows, looked at the valley below, the barn rebuilt and solid, the house with its firmly repaired porch step and its functional pump, the east field laid out for hay. Looked at him. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes. Yes, she said again, and she was smiling, which surprised her slightly because she hadn't planned to smile. It just arrived. He took her hand, not dramatically, just reached out and took it, the way you took something you'd been waiting to hold. His hand was warm and scarred and familiar in a way that meant something. They stood on the south slope in the April morning for a while, not talking, looking at what they were standing in the middle of, which was not a fairy tale and not a clean resolution, but a real thing, with debt still on the books and a legal case still grinding through the county system and 5 children in the house below who were going to have opinions about this development, ranging from relieved to complicated to utterly unsurprised. Thomas is going to say good, Clara said. I know, Ethan said. Margaret is going to ask you 3 questions. They'll seem like they're about practical matters. They won't be. I know that too. Ruth is going to want to put a button in your pocket to celebrate. I'll make sure I have an empty one. She looked at him. He was looking at the seedlings, at the rows Thomas had planned through the winter and planted with the patience of a boy who had decided to take the long view, and his face had the open quality it had sometimes now. Not often, and never carelessly, but when he let it. The face that had been held very tight for a very long time, finding room. She had thought, for a long time, that strength was the ability to need nothing. She had built an entire life on that premise, or tried to, in the years after Robert, and it had kept her standing, but it had also kept her alone in the particular way that competent people were alone, surrounded by what they'd managed, empty of what they'd kept themselves from wanting. She understood now that the premise was wrong. Not wrong as in false. She had been strong, genuinely, the kind of strength that did not come from anywhere except the long practice of getting up and going again when the ground gave way. She didn't want to revise that. It was real and it was hers, and she was going to need it for the rest of her life, because life on a homestead in Montana did not stop being hard because you'd found someone to stand beside. But strength wasn't the same as not needing. Strength was what you brought to what you needed. Strength was what let you ask without collapsing, reach without grasping, love without making it a debt someone owed you back. She'd learned that here, on this slope, in this year. From necessity and from exhaustion, and from a man who had ridden through a storm because he'd seen the sky and thought of her. There were things she still didn't know, whether Harlan's case would resolve the way Crane hoped, whether the South Slope wheat would produce what Thomas's calculations promised, whether the debt would be cleared in 3 years or 4, whether the life she was building now would be the one she'd imagined when she'd stood on her porch a year and a half ago and refused to move. She didn't know any of that. What she knew was this: the wheat was coming up in its rows, and the barn was solid, and her children were in the house below beginning their Saturday in their various ways. Thomas already at the fence line, probably, Margaret with her bread, the twins in their recurring argument, Ruth awake and looking for someone to show her buttons to. And the man beside her was not going anywhere. Not because he'd promised it, though he had, but because she knew how he moved through the world, with the same quiet constancy with which he drove 40 miles of road and trimmed a lamp before dark and repaired a pump without announcing it, and crouched in the dirt to listen to a 4-year-old explain the difference between a horse and a dog. That was what love actually looked like, she'd decided. Not the arrival of it, not the declaring of it. The daily decision to stay present to it, the 10,000 small acts that said, without saying, I am here, I have not left. I am paying attention. She had been paying attention too. We should go down, she said. Margaret will have breakfast. Yes, he said. He didn't let go of her hand. They walked down the slope together in the April morning, through the rows of Thomas's careful wheat, toward the house that had been Robert's and had become hers and was now becoming theirs. And the valley was loud with spring birds, and somewhere in the house below a door opened and she heard Ruth's voice, high and clear, calling for someone, well, anyone, everyone, the way 4-year-olds called, with total confidence that someone would answer. I've got her, Ethan said. He let go of her hand, lengthened his stride, went down the slope ahead of her, and she heard the door and Ruth's voice change pitch immediately to the delighted register that meant she'd found exactly who she'd wanted. Clara stopped on the slope for one moment. Alone, which she was not afraid of. Together, which she was no longer afraid of either. The south slope lay out on either side of her in the morning light, the seedlings in their rows, the work of a year, the beginning of the next year already rooted in the ground. Behind her, the valley stretched east and north toward the hills. Below her, the house. She thought about what it cost to let something matter again after you'd lost it once. She thought about the specific fear of it, not the general fear, but the particular one. The knowledge that the more you loved, the more you stood to lose. That was the mathematics of it, unavoidable and true. You couldn't love without accepting that as the condition of loving. For 2 years, she'd kept the math at arm's length by keeping everything at arm's length. It had kept her safe, and it had kept her lonely, and eventually, the loneliness had become heavier than the risk. And she'd made a choice. Not a brave one, not a dramatic one, just the choice to stop pretending that needing nothing was the same as having everything. She hadn't known she was making it exactly. It had happened in the accumulation of small decisions. The day she'd walked into Ethan's office and asked for 7 days. The day she'd told him about the welfare board before he found out another way. The night she'd said he was what stopped the fear in the barn, which was the first absolutely honest thing she'd said out loud in 2 years. The sum of small decisions. That was how lives actually changed. Not in the dramatic moments, though those existed too, but in the daily recalculation of what you were willing to reach for. She had reached. She started down toward the house, toward the sound of her daughter's laughter, and the man who had come to take everything and had instead given her back the one thing she'd stopped believing in. The simple, uncomplicated fact that she was not alone. The wheat grew behind her in its careful rows. The morning opened up. She went home.